Okay, great. Welcome everybody. Welcome to Empaths and Narcissists. I'm going to call it a mastermind because I reckon there's going to be some very interesting stuff that comes out this evening. And from my own personal experience, when you start down this rabbit hole, there really is only one way that you come out, and that is an expert, normally propelled by your own grief and pain. So delightful. Let me just introduce myself. My name is Dawn Lucht. I'm a life coach and nutritionist. I specialize in mindset and future self programming. And tonight we're here with Linda Barbour, who's a psychotherapist, and I can't remember the other thing.
Coach, yeah.
And the aim for this evening's conversation is for us to talk about our personal experiences and also understand how to navigate the world of the empath and the narcissist. So I'm presuming if you're here on this call, there is a resonance to this material. There's a reason why you're here and interested in this topic. So what I would really love is that this doesn't just become a monologue by Linda and I, but that if you have questions and would like to input, then please put it in the chat box. And when we've got a minute, we can either ask you to ask questions directly, or if you would prefer, then you can just put them in the chat box and we'll answer them as we go along. How does that sound?
That's good.
Okay, so before we start, does anybody have any questions?
Just to say that you're finishing, maybe we're aiming to finish about 8:15, yeah?
Yeah, I've got bedtime to do in this house, so 8:15. But it's a big topic, so we'll see. So thank you, Linda. Thank you for being here tonight. Would you like to introduce yourself and say what got you into the empath and the narcissist programming and where you're at with it all at the moment?
Yeah, I've been a psychotherapist and a coach for 28 years now. Well, psychotherapist for 28 years. I did my coach training in 95, how long that is. And during exactly that time as well was the time when I was married. Like everybody else, when we get married, I was really excited and you're full of hope. And, you know, we had a small farm and we had children and, you know, everything was like ideal, you know, it's like my dream life. But then as time went on, I just became more and more and more unhappy. He you know, he appears to be a very nice guy. Everybody would, you know, everybody really liked him. And I was completely convinced that, you know, I was the problem, you know, and people would look at my life and I would look at my life and say, you know, I haven't got anything to complain about, you know, it's a good life. So there must be something wrong with me. And so for about 10 years of the 24 years or so we were together, I spent ages trying to work it out. And eventually I just got more and more ill. You know, I got diagnosed with fibromyalgia. I became quite depressed. And eventually both the children were, I've got 2 children, both of them were at university. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore. And so we separated. And once we separated, I felt awful. I really thought the difficult bit was getting out of the relationship and leaving. And then I had a complete breakdown. And I really wasn't aware of this kind of more passive, covert type of narcissist. You know, for some reason, it never crossed my radar. I had worked with lots of people in relationships with, you know, abusive or controlling partners, but not really. And I didn't see him at all as being the problem. And it took me quite a long time to kind of realize what had happened to me. So it took a couple of years out of work, and I spent, as you said, became an expert. And I really thought I wasn't going to come back to this work, because I thought, I just felt so stupid, I felt so ashamed, like I should have known this, I should have got out of this much quicker, all that stuff that, I think lots of people, lots of women in particular, go through. And but eventually I just kind of work came to me, and I started working again, and then I thought, actually I can really use my experience, because I do think being involved with a narcissist, if it's something you do not really understand, you don't get it. Because obviously, as a therapist, I knew counsellors, I've been in, good counsellors, I've been involved with various people, but nobody had ever even intimated that's what was going on. I mean, partly because I think I was so convinced I had the problem. And I really think now that, it's really important, if you're working with somebody, therapist or whatever, that they really do understand narcissism, because otherwise I think that therapy and coaching can kind of feed into all of the, we're both taking equal responsibility for this. We're both, we're both working on changing and everything else, and my ex certainly said all the right words in the right order, but it actually didn't change anything. Yeah, so that's where I am.
And what were the behaviors and covert narcissism that you witnessed during that time?
I think for him, he's very passive. So nothing was ever his fault. Nothing was, he didn't take responsibility for things. And, like all narcissists, what he wanted, what he thought, what he felt was more important than what I wanted or what I thought, or anybody else for that matter. But he was just did it in very manipulative ways, rather than being, that kind of bullying, aggressive of way. It was very manipulative. It would always come back onto me, if only I hadn't done this, if you were like this, and I think, I was saying to somebody, I was saying to a friend of mine, I used to get marked out of 10 for my dinners. Of course, you never get a 10, and that was like a joke. He saw that, it was a joke, and because I didn't think it was funny, if I made a comment about this, it was my fault. I didn't understand banter. I didn't have a sense of humour. He was just a bit of a laugh. And it was like that constantly, all the time. It was always, you haven't got a sense of humour. You're oversensitive. You overthink things. That's, on all the gaslighting stuff. Just denying, forgetting. Things,
Did you now that you're I'm going to share a little bit about my story in a minute, but this feels like an important point to just touch on to finish your story. Did you feel that after the fact, after you started getting clarity and awareness and what was happening and how it was working and the dynamics and the plays between each people, and did you come away with the feeling that you were a bystander in what had happened, and actually it kind of happened to you? Or was there a point along the way where you started to realize that there was two perspectives at play and two people within that dynamic that needed to take responsibility for their stuff?
I think it's a really interesting thing, isn't it? That balance, that line, because absolutely, that's what any mental or emotional abuse, even physical abuse is about. It is done to you, and so you are powerless. And it's done slowly over time. They just chip and chip and chip away at you. So yes, there is an element of where I feel totally it was done to me, and I was you know, that's what it's all about. It's about him having power and control in a very, you know, in a very underhanded kind of way. And that's what that dynamic is always about with a narcissist. I thought, you know, people who've got narcissistic tendencies, because that's the nature of what they do. You know, now with all that information that I have, you know, and I wouldn't get myself into that relationship. I think, you know, being empathic, being, you know, somebody who cares, you know, we kind of assume, you know, we project our stuff onto other people. We kind of assume, you know, somebody says they love you, they mean the same thing by it. You know, we both mean the same thing by it. We assume that people are, you know, decent and caring, and that your partner wants the, you know, wanted the best for me, and, you know, wanted me to be happy, and, you know, all of that stuff. I don't do that anymore, because I completely understand that not everybody operates like me at all. And, you know, some people are completely self-centered and self-absorbed. And, you know, however they wrap that up, at the core, that's where they are. You know, and I do think being empathic means that we are very good at kind of you know, feeling other people's feelings, and knowing how somebody else is feeling. And he was definitely that very insecure, you know, felt very kind of inferior person inside. And I think, you know, as people who are empathic, that's what we connect to. I mean, that's what I connected to, and made excuses and excuses for him for years and years. You know, poor guy, you know, look at his upbringing, or, you know, whatever it was, you know, made lots of excuses for him, because I knew, because, you know, I know that deep down he's a very insecure, feels very inadequate kind of person. But it's just so layered on, you know, he's not ever going to touch any of that. He's not ever going to own any of that at all. Apart from, you know, wanting to be a victim all the time, you know, nothing is his fault. You know, and him not taking responsibility for how he feels. So I think it's really complicated, and I do have concerns sometimes about, you know, labeling people as codependent or whatever, because even if we are codependent, that does not entitle somebody else to, you know, it explains why we get into the relationship and why we might stay there, but it doesn't kind of excuse somebody else for their abuse. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're asking me?
Yep.
Yep.
This is such a wonderful conversation, Linda, because for many reasons. The first, I feel, is that this is not something that many people know about. They know about the empath and the narcissist dynamic, perhaps. Maybe I think people are starting to think about what narcissism means and identify it in people, still majority in men rather than women, although there is that too. And what I've come to realize over my journey is that actually all of us are narcissists on some scale, whether you're right down this end and you're not, but equally you can be right down at this end, and all of us are somewhere in between. And that's a hard pill to swallow for many empaths, you know, because we know we are kind, we know we are helpful, we know we are here to help serve and be of service and to support and create happy family and all that kind of stuff, and yet actually the thing that I found interesting is that the more an empath stays with a narcissist, the more they really deeply try to get into their mindset and actually almost become as manipulative from a different standpoint than the narcissist as well. I'll go on to that in a little bit. That's quite a bombshell to drop and run, but I'm just going to preface that by sharing my story a little bit. Back in 2002, I met my husband, ex-husband. He was a very charismatic, very outgoing, very, very intelligent man, could really, absolutely hilarious, really, really funny, had everyone brought in on his humor and his way of thinking and being, and he was really intelligent. And I just thought, wow, like I'm a 22-year-old woman, girl, and I just thought, you are something else. And I'm getting all of this attention, and I'm thinking, this is amazing, I'm getting this attention, I feel good. And I had no idea what I was dealing with, nothing. There was no part of me that understood that this man was a certain way. And what I came to realize through the journey, and what convinced me that it was my fault a lot of the time, was that these are on the surface, people were talking about this stuff and talking about their relationships in a way that I just thought this was normal. I had no reference that this was not an okay relationship or an unhealthy relationship. I just thought that this was the kind of relationship everybody had. And I initially, yes, he was charismatic and all that kind of stuff, but exactly like Linda said, he had this whole woe is me childhood wound thing, and nobody understands me, but you understand me, so that's really great. And now all of these things played into me believing, as the empath in this story, that I was there to love him into wholeness, that my love was going to change his world, and that it was all going to be okay. And from some perspective, that was massively egocentric, right? There was a part of me that thought I could change somebody else, and yet also deeply naive. And I really have so much compassion for 22-year-old Dawn, thinking these thoughts and having this experience with this man, and just kind of going, oh, you really didn't know, did you? And the red flags right from the off were there. They were the way he would talk to me, the way he would belittle me, the way he would joke at me and make fun of me at my expense, the way he would gaslight me, the way that it was always his way or no way. And I just thought, oh, you know, I don't mind. I don't have a strong preference. Like, I had very, very poor boundaries. So whatever he wanted to do, if it actually made me feel better in a really weird way, for him to take charge and control and say, we're going this way, I kind of went, oh, phew, now I don't have to think about it, because that reflected inside of me a deep insecurity that I wasn't aware of, that I was looking for somebody else to lead the way and take charge. And it suited me for all intents and purposes to, you know, at that time. And then the abuse started getting more and more and more. And then after my son came along, it escalated enormously, which is a very common thing when there's a change in focus of attention. And yet from the outside, nobody knew what was going on. I was very protective of our relationship. I never said anything bad about him. I would feel really attacked if anybody said anything about him. I would constantly want to protect him. And yet within the relationship, I thought I was going mad. I thought I just couldn't understand why I couldn't find the right words to get him to understand my point of view. I was constantly shut down. I was gaslit at every single situation that could possibly happen. He would call me stupid, selfish, and it would escalate into even worse things. And yet I completely thought that this was normal. And the narrative that I had over and over again was, he just needs more love. If I just love him just that little bit more, and unconditionally, without boundaries, without anything, if I just show him how much I care, just keep showing him how much I will let him do what he wants to do, it will all be okay. And it really wasn't okay. My period stopped completely. My body started to shut down. I started getting sleepless nights. My work started to suffer. My relationship with my newborn son was trying to be wedged apart. And I had no idea that this was the cause. And then things escalated to a point where a whole heap of stuff was uncovered. A whole different life, this stuff you read about in magazines and newspapers that happened to other people, and it happened to me. And I'm thinking, God, you were so stupid. What was wrong with you? Why didn't you ask those questions? Why didn't you stand up for yourself? And honestly, I was terrified and I didn't even know. Anyway, thankfully, this outside influence happened where a whole heap of stuff was uncovered, and I realized he was having a duplicitous life somewhere else. And that gave me the ending that I needed, because honestly, I don't know if it hadn't have been for my son and for this situation, if I would have left. I probably would have kept justifying myself. And it wasn't until a week later, when I was at my parents' house, a fellow somebody I worked with sent me the women's aid website, and on the front at the time it had 10 ways to show that you're in a domestic violence situation, and I had 7 out of 10. And I can just remember sitting on the sofa shaking with adrenaline, starting to realize what I had been in for all of this time. And I'm an intelligent woman. Yeah, I am not, I find myself intuitive. I can make my own decisions and things like that. And to think that I completely didn't see any of this and put 2 and 2 together was shocking. And it was like every part of my world and my understanding of myself and of him and everything came crashing down. And this is the bit that I was saying to you, Linda. This is when I became a mastermind expert in narcissism and the empath. And I didn't know any of this existed up until that point. But I read a book by a guy called, and I bet you know this guy, Linda, called Lundy Bancroft. And he wrote, oh, I can't remember what it's called now. Why Does He Do That? And I read this book and I underlined every single thing. I was reading it to see if there was a way that he could be cured so we could be together. I was reading it for hope, for a sign that it wasn't over. And I didn't find it. What I did find, I'll tell you what I found in a minute. I just wanted to add something else that Linda said, was I paid for 6 weeks worth of couples counseling. And we went to this couples counseling. I was like, I really want to explore this. I want to see what's going on. And what happened over those 6 weeks was the counselor started to take his side and say that I wasn't doing enough. And I was getting gaslit by both people throughout the whole situation. And then right at the end, he was the only person I know who used to go to therapy and come out singing and dancing, for fuck's sake. Like, I was just, what? Just even thinking about it makes my hands shake. So he went downstairs. I said, just a second, I'm just going to have a word. So he went downstairs and I just said to the counsellor on our last session, you do understand that I am in an abusive marriage here. And the shock on her face, like she had no idea. Because I present well, I don't look like a victim. He presented well, charismatic, energetic, all that kind of stuff. She had no clue. But the one thing I learned after that experience and from reading this book was that I also read this book to see how I could save my son from this relationship. What could I do? What can I do to help him? And what I realized was the only person I can help is me. And what I came to realize was that we were two parts of the same puzzle, and we had slotted in together, and we were playing out this really toxic dynamic. And this is where Linda and I think we've got a slightly different view on this. I didn't want to see myself as a victim of domestic violence. That felt really disempowering. And I'd just spent the last 15 years of my life disempowered, and it didn't feel good. I needed something different. And through reading this book and reading a whole load of stuff, I came to realize that actually there were certain behaviors and certain things that I held true about myself that made me okay with this relationship. Instead of the first sign of anything, I went, no, fuck off, I'm leaving. So there were things like having poor boundaries, low self-esteem, wanting to get other people to make decisions for me because I didn't know how to make them myself, not knowing who I was, not having a sense of strength and inner security, not being able to trust myself to make my own decisions. When a narcissist comes along and says, oh, do you know what, I got this. There's a part of me, like I said at the beginning, that went, oh, thank God, I don't have to do all this stuff that I found really difficult. And he just slotted in and took over. And so for a long time, that's how we lived. But I knew coming out of that relationship that I was never, ever going to allow myself to have that kind of relationship again. And so I was going to look at every single part of my emotional construct that made me a vibrational match to this situation. And I went, no, I'm not doing that anymore. And so I very lovingly looked at the places where I felt in myself helpless and powerless and victim and hopeless. And I've spent the last 10 years working on shifting my perspective, shifting how I feel about myself, shifting my value, my sense of worth, truly allowing myself to feel valuable to myself and having the boundaries, having really healthy boundaries. I will not accept that anymore. And I was so frightened also that he had broken my heart forever and irreparably, that I felt shattered on the inside. And I thought to myself, you are not going to be the reason that I have an unhappy life for the rest of my life. I will not allow that to be your legacy. And so, I mean, I love Brené Brown. Like, there was a lot of Brené Brown in my life for a really long time about having an open heart, but a strong back. And I learned what that meant for me, how that was deeply empowering, that I still wanted that empath, loving kindness, empathic, nurturing, caring part of me to thrive and to shine, but to know that I had my own back, to know that I was boundaried and I knew what I wanted and what I didn't want, and that I could advocate for myself in any situation. It's a hot topic for me, ladies. This is, if there was one life theme that I have been given to really dismantle, and I'm sure, Linda, you feel the same way, or maybe you don't, but I'm presuming, since that's your passion, that this is my big burrito. This is the thing that caught me and held me under. And now I'm finding my way up and out, and I'm helping others, just like Linda is, to find their way out of this, Have you got any questions about any of that? You can unmute yourselves if you'd like, if that's easier.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I believe, well, yeah, covert, passive, totally understand and relate to that. But I was basically discarded, had no idea, didn't see it coming, in the most cruelest way. It's the only way I can describe it. And the question that goes round and round and round in my head and I never asked, because we've spoken since. I've never asked, why were you so angry at me that day? And
Why what? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
why were you so angry at me?
Who?
Like,
He?
yeah.
That's what you're asking him.
Yeah, and I just, it goes round and round in my head, and I'm like, I've got a book on mind games, and I have an example for 24 of the mind games, and I'm like, me and my friend were having this conversation today. I'm like, I get it, but I still don't, like, why can I not get it? So do you ever get to a point where you just get it and just say enough? Like, because you could drive yourself crazy with it, but I just feel like there's always, you do become an expert on it, and that's you can't, and I love to learn naturally anyway. I love personal development, so this is kind of like just going on top of that. But do you ever get to that point where you're just like, I'm done? Like, does that make sense? That you're never going to get the answer?
No.
Like, I have my guesses as to why, and it's almost like I'm feeling so much pain and hurt, I have no idea to deal with it, or I'm going to put it all onto you. I totally understand that, but is that, like, do you just have to make your own judgments on this? Or
Linda, do you want to go first?
Personally, I think that they don't care enough about you really to be angry with you. I think they have anger that they project out, but how I've come to terms, how I've kind of rationalized it, is it's something I can understand intellectually, but obviously because it's something that's so different from me, I just have to do it. But I don't think they care enough. Honestly, I don't think they do. I think they're so caught up in their own ego and their own energy, because, for me, the way I've kind of processed all of that is that it's not personal, because I could have been anyone, you could have been anybody. It's not personal to me. I just happened to be the person who was there in that relationship, and and it's a really, really common thing to discard, because although I left, you very quickly got involved with somebody else and just like completely cut me off, even though we have 2 children together who still needed their parents. And I honestly think it's not personal, because it wouldn't matter who you are, because they all do it. It's a really common thing. They all do it, to all sorts of people. It's just how they are.
Yeah, I relate to that a little bit, especially when you said like the way that they move on. It's almost like they just
Yeah.
mean that we just don't think the same way.
No, and honestly, that he'd do that. You could have been anybody. It wasn't a personal thing. That's just what they do. It's just how they, they just shut one off and then move on, because actually they're not emotionally invested in the way that we understand having an emotional investment in something. They don't, other than what's in it for me. And then when you don't feed them, when you don't, you're not the supply or whatever anymore, they move on. But I think the very covert stuff is very different, and I think it has a very different effect in some ways. I think, people will still say to me, oh, but he hasn't done anything wrong, because he hasn't. On the face of it, he has done nothing wrong. It's not like a situation where he had an affair or something and you can say, well, he did that. And the face of it, he did nothing wrong. We weren't together when he moved on, but he definitely cut me off after, I don't know, 28 years together, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, when you say like you've done nothing wrong, it's interesting, because when I spoke to me and my friend were chatting today generally, and the new WhatsApp pic's gone up, and I was just like, because I was just searching for something on my phone and it popped up. I was like, again, are you for real? And I'm just like, Do you know what? And I said to my friend, I have those pictures, I have the lovely memories of holidays. I said, but what you don't also see is what I have in my journal, and I journal every day, and it's been my absolute godsend and my puzzle piece, because I journal every day. So it's all there. Is the fact when they turn around and say, oh, can we not talk about this while we're away? So it's very passive, and it's horrible.
Yeah, and it really gets into your...
Yeah, because you start questioning your own self. Like,
absolutely. You believe in the end. Yeah, I mean, in the end, I believed him. I did believe him in the end, and I think that's part of being, somebody who's self-aware, who does take self-responsibility, all of that stuff. That we're very quick to, oh, maybe it is me. Yeah, I'm not talking about after the relationship, because then I think, as you're saying, Dawn, it's a totally different process then, isn't it? Of, what was it about me that got me into this relationship and kept me in it? And obviously healing those bits and working on those bits. But I think when you're in it, it's very different, isn't it? It's because it is such a, because it's crazy. And it's fantastic you had a journal, isn't it? Because it's like, I found some old journals as well, and it was really good, because it was like, actually that did happen. I did feel like that. I did. Do you know what I mean? Because then because they rewrite history all the time, so it's like, well, maybe I wasn't that. It wasn't a big deal. But like you're saying, having a journal is brilliant.
it's one thing, like when I saw the counsellor, she said, like, you've done something most people never do, and she said your journal is full of it. It's there for my brain dump, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it does make such a difference. I think when you question yourself and you're like, well, there it's in black and white. Like, I did write it on this day. Like, I didn't make it up. I'm not writing fairy tales here. Far from it.
And it's a really good way of kind of holding on to yourself, isn't it? Because I think that's, one of the hardest things is that you kind of lose your sense of who you are.
Oh, massively.
Because you're told.
Disqualified, don't you?
Pardon?
You become completely disqualified. They disqualify you and your experience. You disqualify you and your experience. And so the only valid person who has an opinion is them.
Yeah.
But what I find really interesting about a narcissist, and just to talk to your point, Kerry, is, have you researched narcissistic rage? So then that what happens with narcissistic rage is they have a sense of identity that they're holding on to for dear life. Yeah. And when that gets challenged in some way, that's when it can escalate. Now, the interesting dynamic that I've noticed that happened for me is the smaller I tried to make myself, because that's what I did, the bigger the rage became. And the smaller it's like the lion and the mouse, the smaller I tried to make myself, the bigger and bigger he became. And yet when I now, in the relationship that I have with him, because obviously we're still parenting, because I am now not that mouse anymore, the relationship is 100% completely, totally different. Like, completely different. And for a long time I thought to myself, oh great, now I've got to co-parent with my abuser. That was my thought. Oh great, now I'm stuck in this abusive relationship for the rest of my life. And no, actually, I mean, he still hasn't changed, but I've changed. And the way that this dynamic now plays out with his rage is it gets shut down immediately. I'm not playing it. Whereas when we were in it before, there was always for me a sense of justifying myself, and it would seem to enrage him, and yet my complete thought was, how do I stop this? How my intention is to make it smaller, not bigger. And why is it making it bigger when I want it smaller? Like, what am I doing wrong here? So like you were saying, Linda, not knowing, I lost my train of thought there, but it is never their fault. The reason he and I split up was apparently because I became a yoga teacher. And that's what he told everybody. And it's ludicrous, right? I mean,
I'm laughing so much because I got an email back saying couldn't be with somebody who's not 100% doggy friendly after 2 years.
I mean,
So I just, it's laughable.
it's ridiculous. It's really, really ridiculous. But what's really, I want to...
They are ridiculous. That's a really good way, isn't it, of dealing with them.
But it's not personal. Exactly like Linda said, none of this is personal. It isn't, they weren't ever angry at you. It wasn't because of something you did. It wasn't, you could have fitted yourself into the most perfect box and it still would have pissed them off. And I bet you tried. So if there's one thing that you could take away from this, it would be to remind yourself, never was it personal, ever. And the moment you think that it is personal, it makes you feel helpless. Do you know what I mean? They have such strong black and white mental walls that cannot be moved or overcome. And they will hang on to their framework that they've created inside of themselves that doesn't involve anybody else. That they will defend to the end that framework that they hold true about themselves. And I found actually the more loving I was, the worse it got.
I think that's the thing. I think they're all kind of different in the ways that they do it, aren't they?
Linda, what would your advice be to somebody who is going through this situation?
Sorry, I missed the first bit you said.
What would your advice be to somebody who is going through this situation? How would you suggest?
Who's in it or else of it?
Well, let's start within it and then out of it.
I think a kind of empowering, there's nothing you can do. This isn't going to change. I think for me, that, and I don't mean that in a very passive way at all, for me, kind of thinking this isn't going to change. Nothing, and just kind of run out of excuses. I think it's just, there's nothing you can do. And in an empowering way, in a very proactive way, there is nothing you can do. Like you said, you can turn yourself inside out and backwards, you can be the perfect whatever, it's not going to change because it's nothing to do with you. There's nothing you can do, and they're never going to take responsibility. And when somebody doesn't take responsibility, nothing changes. The point at which things change is where someone takes responsibility.
I was always waiting for him just to be all bad. And it was never all bad. And so I would flip-flop between, is he a good man or is he a bad man? Which one is he? And because he'd sometimes do good things, I've been convinced myself that the bad stuff wasn't really as bad, until I realized, exactly like you just said, Linda, that it was never going to change. And that was a terrifying thought, but also a very empowering one at the same time. So what else could somebody do after they've realized that?
Yeah, absolutely need support. Friends, family, you need professional support, people like Sinead and solicitors and all sorts of people, because I think when you come out of those relationships, you are so disempowered, you feel very powerless, you feel, you're full of self-doubt, you're very self-critical, I think, very ashamed, anxious, I think you've got so much going on. I think it's really important to have people around you who get it, who understand it, who know about it, and can support you in practical and emotional ways. And I think it's it depends on the person and their their previous experience, and prior to that, what their family upbringing was like, and their personality and their situation. But it's then that process of moving on, and the practical stuff is one thing, but I think the emotional, mental stuff is another process, and that you need to. I don't think time heals it. I think it's one of those things that time doesn't heal.
I agree.
I think it is about, first thing is information. Really educating yourself. It's really important. Reading and understanding about it. Being in groups online and whatever, reading books. It's really important to just understand it first of all, because I think it's that. I call it my shit, your shit. I think it's really important. I think that's the first stage, is to really understand actually that's them, and that's all their kind of stuff. But actually, this is me, and this is my stuff. Because I think in the, when you first come out, you just don't know. You can't see the wood for the trees. You can't think clearly. So I think, that's the advantage of working with somebody else, I think, is that they can do that much more quickly for you and say, actually, this is your stuff. This is what you need to work through. And actually, you just need to give that to them and let them live with that, because that's theirs and there's nothing you can do with that. So I think it's that process, education, really sorting out what is my stuff that I need to own and I need to understand about myself, and maybe change about myself, but certainly take responsibility for, and then healing the trauma. It's very traumatic. So I think there's lots of things, as you said, learning about boundaries, setting boundaries, rebuilding your self-esteem and your confidence. And I think, so it's quite a long process. Not necessarily be long in time, but I think certainly having support gets you through it a lot more quickly and more easily.
Definitely. I would also add that if you're going through any sort of divorce proceedings or anything to do with children or custody or anything like that, it is not the same for a normal couple. It is not the same. So do not go down mediation. Make sure you get a lawyer who understands what they're dealing with. Get CAFCAS involved if you need to. Research. Get Women's Aid involved. Ask. There's a company online that also does free 30-minute legal advice, which is really helpful. I can't remember might even be Legal Aid. I can't remember. But know that the system is currently set up so that it's trying to be as fair to both parties. And you need to go in knowing what you're talking about, and make sure that you get a lawyer who also understands the situation so they can advocate for you when you absolutely cannot, because you will roll over just to make sure that you have as peaceful time as possible. And it's not quite over yet,
Yeah, I agree with you. I had a solicitor who didn't get it, and he did in the end, but it took him a long time. I think mainly, I didn't properly understand it when I started going through the divorce, but I think it's so important, and you hear such awful stories of what happens to children and how children get used, and how the court system doesn't support, because like you say, they're seeing both people as equally responsible or whatever, aren't they? And
my CAFCAS officer told me to go home and take a bath. Like, she really didn't understand that I was at my limit with trauma and abuse. and all I needed was a bath. And I thought, I'm not sure what I need to do right now, kill you or go home and have a bath. It all feels a little intense, really. So on the whole, trying to find somebody who really gets it, even if it's somebody in a community. There's, like Linda was saying, forums can be with discernment really supportive, but use your discernment. If you're not sure, soundboard it with somebody else, because right at the beginning stages, as you come out, your judgment, your perception of situations is wonky, and so you need like somebody who you know is solid, who has good understanding of themselves in this situation, who can help steer you a bit more, whether that's a professional or somebody you just trust within you or within your situation, until you learn that yourself. But right at the beginning, it's a challenge.
Yeah, definitely a process.
Yeah. Is there anything else, Linda, before we finish, that you would like to add?
No, it's been really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? One last question that we can answer. No, nothing. Last thing I will finish on is to say that this is something that can be overcome. This is something that you doesn't have to define you for the rest of your life. You can grow from this. You can find a way through this. It is possible and it is available to you. There is so much help out there now and so much more understanding about this dynamic that it is available. And if you're in Colchester, there's like the Next Chapter group I used, which was fantastic as I came into this next stage after the court battles and all that kind of stuff. Was so helpful in helping me back into normal life, because that next stage, like I'm sure Linda, we could talk for years about the next stage, is what does normal look like now? And how do you reintegrate with PTSD, with all this other stuff that's running through, the fear that runs through your nervous system? What happens next? But I want you to know, and I'm sure, I think, Linda, you would agree that this is an overcomable experience.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, people, I've only worked with women, but loads of women do move on from it. Yeah, definitely. Even people like yourself who are still in contact with them and still have to share parenting with them. It's
like, I wouldn't recommend that.
No,
if you can avoid it.
It's bad enough, and my children are in their 20s, to be honest. But
it's doable. It's doable.
Yeah.
Well, Linda, thank you so much for your time and expertise this evening. It's such an important topic, and I think the more we can bring awareness to this, the more empowered everyone can be.
Yeah. And if any of you do want to contact me, with anything, then do that. I'm really happy to, I give people an hour free, so I'm really happy to do that. I'm sure you do as well, don't you, Don?
I do.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for your time tonight, everybody. We will be putting the link in the, I was going to say the show notes, but that's not a podcast, in the Facebook group after this. In the meantime, thank you for coming, and good luck on your journeys, and sending you lots of love. Take care.